Tanzania, and Canada. My guest is a member of the Commonwealth Eminent Persons Group and Senator in the Canadian Parliament, Hugh Segal. Welcome to the channel.
Good to be here, Frank.
You talked about Commonwealth values, democracy, rule of law, human rights. But members of the Commonwealth, do you see them upholding these values? I mean, if you look around, especially in developing countries,
right.
There are problems regarding those values. Now, the Commonwealth is supposed to be an intergovernmental organization
Yes.
with shared values.
Yes.
Now, what happens when these values are not upheld? For instance, like in Zimbabwe,
right.
which you advocated for Zimbabwe's expulsion from there.
Indeed. In the Canadian Senate, I had a motion passed unanimously, not only that they be expelled from the Commonwealth, but that we break off our diplomatic relations with Zimbabwe. And that was at a time, some months ago, when the newspaper reports, Harare Times and others, were talking about the arrival of the cases of champagne and the caviar and the rest for Mugabe's 80th birthday party, and while kids were dying of hunger in Harare and out in the countryside. And you know, it struck me anyway as a violation of every possible Commonwealth value of hope and fairness and decency. Now, my government didn't take my advice, which often happens with senators. They kept their mission open, and a whole bunch of other Commonwealth countries kept their missions open in Zimbabwe. Why? Because they're providing aid and assistance to NGOs working on food aid, medical issues, and health issues. So while Mugabe himself and his government is outside the Commonwealth now, there's still a light in the window. There's still a candle in the window for the people who we view as former and prospective Commonwealth citizens living in Zimbabwe, because we hope there will be some process by which they go through fair elections and where Zimbabweans themselves make their choice, and then that principle of democracy is upheld. None of the countries in the Commonwealth, including my own, is a perfect democracy. We all have difficulties and problems. That's not the test. The test, in my judgment, is every country, by and large, doing its best to improve its democracy, to sustain real democratic values, to protect human rights. Not every country will do it in the same way, and not all countries will be at the same point on the spectrum for a whole bunch of reasons. It is tougher for countries that have massive poverty, that have large amounts of young people who are, even though they've been educated, can't find work. It's actually harder to have a balanced and smooth democracy when so many people are justifiably angry and feel badly treated and feel they have no prospect. That's where the Commonwealth has to say, what can we be doing as partners with that country to help on economic development, to help with respect to investment, so there are job opportunities. So the notion of hope is actually real in people's lives and not just a figment of some politician's imagination. That's part of what the Commonwealth, I think, has to do better than they're doing. Doesn't mean that we look away from the successes of the past, but we have to never, ever be complacent about the future. And that's part of what the EPG, our Eminent Persons Group, is trying to address in the sorts of changes and improvements which we think will advance the Commonwealth cause more directly.
One of the criticisms about the Commonwealth is that it doesn't have an effective enforcement mechanism. Now, you talked about Zimbabwe. First of all, does it help Zimbabwe expulsion from the Commonwealth? Who does it hurt? Does it hurt? It seems that it hurts more the Zimbabwean people rather than the government.
Right. Let's be fair about what happened in Zimbabwe. The Commonwealth was beginning to express concerns about some of the problems. And then President Mugabe himself said, that is the old British colonialism. We want no part of it. And by the way, the land problems we're trying to settle in our country is a legacy of the old white British supremacy and colonialism. We want no part of it. We're pulling out of the Commonwealth. So it was the government of Zimbabwe that pulled out of the Commonwealth for reasons that related to their domestic politics, which I respect and understand. I don't respect Mr. Mugabe's politics, but I understand why a politician might do that. Our question now, and you can say the same thing about La Francophonie and Côte d'Ivoire, when they went through their difficulty, what can we do outside of Zimbabwe through our missions inside the country to assist in that process by which Zimbabweans take control of their own future, strengthen their own democratic process, and in that sense re-earn the right to be part of the Commonwealth on an equal basis with the rest of us.
But how can you do that if you severed relationship with them?
Well, because while the Commonwealth itself has been severed by Mugabe, the Commonwealth countries, the United Kingdom, Canada, and others, still have missions operating, still have ambassadors, still have aid budgets, which are being deployed constructively to assist in that process. That hasn't stopped. And because we're all in the Commonwealth, we talk to each other about how best to do that, how to coordinate, how to have most effectiveness on the ground. So that's the way it has to happen when a leader decides to boot the Commonwealth out. Sometimes the Commonwealth decides to boot a country out, but in this particular case, the leader decided to boot the Commonwealth out, and that's just part of the reality on the ground.
What else do you have apart from, say, expelling a member from the organization?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's exactly what we're trying to deal with in the EPG. You know, if all you can do when you're part of a 54-nation club with 2.4 billion people in that club is decide country A is in or out, that's the only option you have, then you're right. That is a limited toolbox. It's a very limited toolbox by which to make a difference. We're recommending, for example, that we have a commissioner for the rule of law and democracy who operates on a roving ambassadorial basis, working with countries that are trying to improve their democratic system. If a country petitions to join the Commonwealth, and we've had countries petition to join the Commonwealth recently.
Like Rwanda.
Rwanda, Mozambique came in recently, Cameroon came in recently, countries that are normally associated with the Portuguese or the French tradition here in Africa. The political decision was to admit them all. I think they were good decisions, if I may say so. We're suggesting that in the future, for other kind of circumstances of accession where other countries want to join, we would dispatch our commissioner for the rule of law and democracy who would go to a country and do an assessment. He would meet with the media. He would meet with the governing people, the electoral commission. He would meet with the judiciary. He or she, I should say, to be fair, would meet with the opposition. He would meet with youth groups and unions to get a sense of what's actually going on in that country. What is the level of democratic engagement? And he could report back so that the heads of government and the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group, which makes decisions about these things, would have an independent assessment of reality on the ground by which they can say, you know what, as a country, we'd like to have you as a member. There are a few things that maybe need to be improved. And by the way, the EU has been doing this. If you watch the EU for years, people have been petitioning to join the EU. All those countries from Eastern Europe, well, they had to meet certain tests about democracy, about economic performance. We would be able to say, if you want to work with us and we can achieve some progress together as partners, then we'd be delighted to have you join. You don't have to be perfect before you join. Nobody is. The old members aren't. You know, India, Singapore, none of us are perfect. But if you're working in the direction of improvement and trying to respect some of these principles over time, that's the basis upon which we'd be delighted to have you join. And so that's a new dynamic which does not now exist. The other thing we're suggesting, and this is really from the Côte d'Ivoire experience, but it also in some respects reflects a little bit of what we saw after the last election in Kenya. Rather than just send in a team of observers to say, you know what, election day went fine. The ballots were equally distributed. The voting stations were without intimidation. People could vote privately and secretly. The count was honest. That's all very good. But what do you do if you're going to send a team, you've agreed to send a team for an election a month and a half away, and the government de jure decides to arrest the entire opposition and throw them in jail in the 5 weeks setting up to the campaign? Do you still send your team to put the good housekeeping stamp on election day when the actual process is not democratic? Democracy is more than just elections. Elections is one piece. Fairness, equality of opportunity so the political parties can express their views, the right to communicate, freedom of the press, things that we take for granted in many countries, but in some parts of the Commonwealth, not so much. We're saying we should have a more integrated democratic observer team that arrives well in advance of an election to do some of this work, report publicly, and then stay afterwards to help constructively with the transition. Somebody yesterday at one of the meetings I had here in Dar made a wonderful, wonderful suggestion, and part of why I'm here is to get suggestions about our draft report as to how it might be improved before it's finalized. That the Commonwealth should be thinking about what they call preventive diplomacy and post-conflict transition. That we should be far more focused on those skill sets than we have been in the past. And I think that's a wonderful idea for which I'm going to give Africa and Tanzania full credit as we begin the process of finalizing our report.
Okay. You also advocate for a Commonwealth stabilizing force. What is that all about?
Well, in the report itself, the draft report, there is no reference to that. That's one of the positions that I've been interested in having people consider. First of all, we need to have the capacity, because so many of the countries in the Commonwealth face climate change vulnerabilities. You know, for places like Kiribati and Vanuatu and others, Pacific Ocean, this notion of the sea level going up, it's actually not an esoteric proposition. It's a serious survival issue. We've had some terrible, terrible tragedies in places like Australia in terms of flooding and tsunami and others. And a lot of skill sets have been enhanced and built, and expertise. We're saying now, well, we want to have the capacity to have an ongoing training process so every country in the Commonwealth can take its first responders, its disaster response supervisors, and have them be experienced to other members in the Commonwealth who've had experiences and learnt therefrom. And we should have a roster of people who can be easily deployed to assist any country that's facing that kind of difficulty. Now, that kind of difficulty can be a difficulty around climate change and a natural disaster. It can also be a difficulty around, in some cases, insurgencies or terrorism or that sort of thing, and other countries do have experiences in that respect. I think of our friends, our chairman, Tun Abdul Badawi, is a former prime minister of Malaysia. Well, Malaya, before it became Malaysia, was in fact under threat by a very tough armed communist insurgency. And Commonwealth forces deployed with Malaysian forces to help put that down. And now Malaysia is a thriving democracy, doing extremely well in Asia. Well, we have to be able to help each other. We're not a military organization by definition. We're not a military alliance. But a lot of Commonwealth, for example, a lot of senior officers in the Tanzanian armed forces have been able to do some training with their colleagues in Canada. We've been delighted to be part of that process, to share our skill sets with them and to learn from them in terms of what they bring to the table. We should be doing more of that around the Commonwealth so we build a coherent response capacity, because we all want the same things: democracy, prosperity for our people, stability and freedom. And sometimes there are dark forces who really aren't interested in those things for various reasons. We have to have the capacity to know how to respond to that together.
But what one may say, there is the United Nations there. It's not working as it's not the most effective organization, but it is there that does those functions. So you have an overlapping function of the Commonwealth and the United Nations.
Well, let's be clear. There'd be very few members of the Commonwealth who are not members of other organizations. Canada is a member of NATO. Canada is a member of NORAD. Canada is a member of the Organization of American States. Canada has a series of overlapping relationships, as do many African countries who are in regional and other groupings. And now there's groupings around trade with our Indian friends and our Turkish friends involving many African countries, all of which are good things. The difference, if I may say so, with the Commonwealth is when there was problems in the Sudan, and the world wanted to engage much more robustly in the Sudan than they have, China and Russia vetoed that at the UN. They vetoed that proposition because they didn't want to see the world intervening in what they saw as a domestic circumstance of another country. In our context, the Commonwealth doesn't have to go through that process. If one of our members asks for help, of a security nature, of a planning nature, of a strategic nature, of an agricultural nature, whatever that may be, the Secretary General takes that request to CMAG, which is the Commonwealth Ministers' Action Group, about 15 ministers, presently chaired by the Foreign Minister of Ghana. They make the decision, and then countries muster up the troops, support whatever is necessary to be there. We don't have to go through that hierarchy at the UN, which is very oppressive. And I think that gives us more flexibility. And because we've all worked with each other in partnership before on so many issues, as Canada and Tanzania has, we know each other better. We have a better relationship than is sometimes the case between perhaps a Chinese ambassador to the UN and the South African administration, as the case may be.
All right. You just mentioned that the